When people think of the Ottoman Empire, they think of sultans, scimitars, janissaries. But there was another force that helped hold together one of the most sprawling empires in human history. And it had 4 legs, a jaw like a steel trap, and absolutely no interest in politics. The dogs of the Ottoman Empire weren't pets. They were instruments of power. And the story of how they got there is stranger, bloodier, and more fascinating than you'd expect. Let's start with the dog everyone thinks they know. The Kangal. If you search for the Kangal today, you'll find articles calling it a Turkish national treasure, a livestock guardian, the most powerful dog bite on earth. All of that is broadly true. But the origin story you usually hear, that it's a simple shepherd's dog from Sivas province, loyal to the flock, gentle with the family, strips out about 500 years of imperial context. The Kangal's ancestors weren't just working dogs on a hillside. They were deliberate assets in a border management system that stretched from the Balkans to the Caucasus. Here's the geography that matters. The Ottoman Empire at its height ran from Hungary to the Persian Gulf. That's not a border, that's 1,000 borders, and most of them cut through rough mountainous terrain where cavalry couldn't patrol and infantry couldn't hold. Wolves were a serious economic threat to the livestock networks that fed the army. Bandits were worse, and in the contested highland zones between Ottoman Safavid and later Russian territory, the line between raiding and warfare barely existed. Into this chaos, the Ottomans deployed dogs. Large, pale, fast, and ferocious. The kind of dog that didn't need a handler once it knew its job. And the Kangal type, or something very close to it, was the template. Here's where the history gets genuinely surprising. The Ottoman court maintained formal imperial kennels. It was a bureaucratic office of state. The Sarachain, the palace complex, kept hunting dogs as a mark of imperial prestige, as every medieval court did. But the Ottomans went further. There were designated dog keepers, köpekçiler, as part of the palace household. Hunting with dogs, particularly the Tazi, the Ottoman sighthound, was a sultan's sport. Suleiman the Magnificent hunted with dogs. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, maintained hunting animals, including dogs, as part of his broader menagerie of power. But the really interesting layer isn't the palace dogs, it's the working dogs in the provinces. Ottoman administrative records, including tax registers and provincial inventories, reference dogs as assets in ways that suggest they were tracked and valued. In pastoral regions of Anatolia, dogs were tied to the economic output of sheep herds, which were themselves a taxable resource. A village with a large flock needed large dogs. Those dogs were, in a very real sense, part of the empire's agricultural infrastructure. The Ottoman system of border management in Anatolia relied heavily on what historians call the Yuruk, semi-nomadic pastoralists who were given land rights and tax exemptions in exchange for military service, and, crucially, for maintaining the highland pastures and the roads through them. The dogs that travelled with the Yuruk weren't just flock guardians. They were, functionally, a distributed security network. A predator, wolf, bear, or human, that hit a flock guarded by Kangal-type dogs was dealing with animals that could run at 45 kilometers an hour and sustain a fight against multiple opponents. The distinctive black mask and pale coat of the Kangal isn't just aesthetics. Working shepherds in Anatolia believed the pale coat helped distinguish the dog from wolves in low light. A practical advantage in exactly the kind of terrain where the empire's borders were most porous. There are accounts, some admittedly difficult to pin to primary sources, of large shepherd dogs being used to harry the flanks of raiding parties in highland territory. Not as trained war dogs in the Roman sense, but as a natural consequence of letting territorial livestock guardians do what they were bred to do when strangers moved through their range. No honest account of Ottoman dogs leaves out Constantinople's street dogs, because they were one of the most remarkable urban animal populations in history. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Istanbul's street dog population was enormous. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands. These weren't strays in the modern sense. They were a recognized part of the city's functioning. They were fed by residents, organized into territorial packs by neighborhood, and performed genuine sanitation services in a pre-modern city where garbage removal was not a municipal priority. European visitors found them alarming. Packs of large, rough-coated animals sleeping in doorways, moving through bazaars, claiming specific corners of specific streets as their own. What struck outsiders as chaos was, to anyone who actually lived in the city, a functioning system. There was a theological dimension too. Islamic tradition holds that dogs are ritually unclean. Contact requires ritual washing, but it doesn't mandate their destruction. Residents fed the dogs. Neighborhoods took informal ownership of their local packs. If a dog was sick or injured, people noticed. The dogs had function. They were allowed to have it. It was only in the early 20th century, under the modernizing pressure of the late Ottoman period, that authorities decided the street dogs were an embarrassment, a symbol of backwardness that a reforming empire couldn't afford. The solution they landed on was to round up tens of thousands of dogs and ship them to Sivriada, a small uninhabited island in the Sea of Marmara, and simply leave them there with no food and no water. It was not a relocation program. It was a death sentence dressed up as logistics. The animals starved. Contemporary accounts describe the howling carrying across the water to the mainland for days. It remains one of the more disturbing episodes in the history of urban animal management, and it was largely forgotten until researchers began revisiting Ottoman municipal records in recent decades. The dogs of the Ottoman Empire tell us something that gets lost in the grand narrative of sultans and sieges. Empires don't just run on armies and taxes. They run on systems, networks of infrastructure, agriculture, labor, and yes, animals. Remove the dogs from the picture, and the pastoral economy of Anatolia looks different. The highland borders look more porous. The streets of Constantinople look grimmer and less safe. The Kangal on a hillside in Sivas wasn't a sentimental footnote. It was load-bearing. The wolf it drove off was a sheep that made it to market, a tax that got paid, a soldier who got fed. Multiply that across 10,000 hillsides, and you start to understand why these dogs persist today, recognizably the same animal, long after the empire that shaped them is gone. That dog, pale as dust, black-masked, standing between the flock and whatever came out of the dark, it was doing the empire's work. It just didn't know it. If you want to go deeper on the history of working dogs in the ancient and medieval world, I've got a full series going. Links below. And if you're interested in the broader story of how livestock guardian breeds shaped human civilization, that's coming very soon. Subscribe if you're not already. Drop a comment with which empire's dogs you want covered next. And I'll see you in the next one.